Has the KD and Kyrie experiment been a failure for the Brooklyn Nets? When the Nets originally signed KD and Kyrie, the expectation was championship or bust, and at this point it's been over 2 full seasons, and the Nets still haven't even made it to the NBA Finals, which brings up the question if this experiment was a failure. But quickly before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports, I make opinionative NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you're interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetic.
When Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving originally signed with Brooklyn all the way back in 2019, a lot of people, including myself, didn't necessarily know if any team in the NBA could beat them. And although KD was coming off an Achilles injury and probably was going to miss the entirety of his first season with the Nets, it wasn't necessarily seen as a major issue like it would be for other players, solely due to the fact that Kevin Durant doesn't necessarily rely on his athleticism in order to score buckets out there. But in the first season after KD and Kyrie signed with the Nets had a record of 35 and 37, but people weren't necessarily all that concerned due to the fact that that was the bubble year, but also due to the fact that KD didn't play at all that season and Kyrie also didn't play that much that year, so that season was basically seen as a wash for the Nets. But in the following 2021 season, that's really where the expectations started for the Nets. And early on into that season, the Nets certainly did go through certain struggles, which was to be expected because they were a brand new team together, but overall I would say they were playing relatively well. But around a quarter way through the season, the Nets were then able to acquire another star in James Harden to create a big three in Brooklyn. And at that point, it was basically a done deal to many fans around the NBA that the Nets were going to win the championship that season. The amount of talent they had on their team was so far ahead of any other team in the NBA, it was almost to the point that it wasn't fair. But one issue that did persist that season was not all three of their stars in KD, Kyrie, and James Harden were able to play many games on the court together. Now, one thing I will say is when they were able to all play on the court together, they were absolutely phenomenal and basically unbeatable. But the one question and concern going into the playoffs that season was, are those three guys going to be able to play together healthy for the entirety of the playoffs? But when it was actually coming down to the playoffs, in the Nets' first round matchup against the Boston Celtics, all three of their guys in KD, Kyrie, and James Harden were all healthy throughout that series, and the Nets dominated that series, winning in 5 games. Which is pretty ironic that they beat the Celtics in the first round in a 2-7 matchup, because that will come up later in the video. But after that series did end, a lot of fans were very excited about their performance, not only due to the fact that they won, because most people expected them to win that series, but it was the way they won and the way their 3 stars looked playing all together. They looked like a very dominant team. And at that point, a lot of people were very confident in their picks of the Nets winning the championship that season. And in the second round, the Nets were then going to go up against the Milwaukee Bucks, who a lot of people saw the Bucks as legitimate championship contenders, but at the same time, most people thought the Nets were probably going to win that series in 6 or maybe 7 games if needed. But one of the concerns going into the season for the Nets was starting to pop up as both Kyrie Irving and James Harden were getting injured a lot in that series. Now for James Harden, he did play at the latter half of that series, but it was pretty clear that he was certainly hurt and he just was not playing at the level that James Harden typically would play at. And due to those injuries and some other factors, the Nets ended up losing that series in 7 games to the Bucks. And after the Nets did lose that series, a lot of fans certainly were disappointed due to the fact that they had the Nets as championship favorites, but at the same time, a lot of people contributed their loss to injuries, so they weren't necessarily all that concerned about the Nets going forward, and assuming their stars could stay healthy for the following season, a lot of people thought the Nets would probably just win the championship next season. But of course, there certainly was some disappointment involved in their loss. And that brings us to this season, where going into the year, a lot of people had sky-high expectations once again for the Nets, as they thought the fact that their big three would now have a full season playing together would be very beneficial to them, and they could use that chemistry and experience in order to win a championship this season. Now, as we know, the Nets did face a ton of adversity this season, with the whole Kyrie Irving situation and the fact that he wasn't able to play home games, the fact that James Harden didn't want to be a part of the Nets and they ended up trading him away just a season after trading for him. But even after the Nets did trade away James Harden, a lot of people around the NBA thought the Nets actually won that trade, and the return they got actually made them a better team. So the expectations were still to win a championship even after that James Harden trade. And although during the regular season the Nets didn't necessarily play as well as they would have liked, because at the end of the year they were only the 7th seed and had to play in the play-in game, many people didn't necessarily think that was a huge deal, as the Nets were championship contenders clearly, and it didn't necessarily matter what seed they were. And going into their first round matchup against the Boston Celtics, a lot of people thought it'd be a very interesting and very close series, but at the same time, a decent amount of people did think the Nets were probably going to win the series in, once again, 6 or 7 games. But of course, as we all know now, the Nets ended up getting swept by the Celtics, and the new thing that a lot of people were saying is the Nets lost because of the fact that Ben Simmons wasn't playing at all of this series, wasn't playing home games during the regular season, and there was just a lot of different issues that the Nets were facing during the season, which kind of carried over into the playoffs. And in my opinion, a real theme was starting to arise. Whenever the Nets were to lose a playoff series, there would be a new excuse that a lot of NBA fans would give to the Nets and would say that the following season they could easily win the championship that season, which is obviously not a great look for a team this talented. But now let's get into the question of the video, which is, do I personally think this KD and Kyrie experiment was a failure, or do I not think so? Now, whenever you have multiple all-stars or multiple superstars on your team, I think the expectation is always to win the championship, and if you don't win a championship that season should be seen as a bust. But when you consider the level of talent that the Nets have in Kevin Durant, who's arguably the best player in the NBA, I personally think it's Giannis at this point, but you certainly could make the case for KD being the best, and also Kyrie Irving, who's arguably the most talented player in the NBA, the expectations for them clearly should be and were championship or bust. And the fact that the Nets had 2 full seasons and didn't win a championship or even make it to the NBA Finals in either season, I think is certainly a huge disappointment for them. And yeah, the Nets certainly did go through some issues in both seasons, but when you look at teams over the years that won NBA championships and had NBA stars, what team didn't go through some issues? Every team throughout every single season always goes through certain issues, but the teams that win the NBA championship are the teams that are able to overcome those issues. And it's pretty clear that both seasons that KD and Kyrie were together, they weren't able to overcome those issues. Now, in my opinion, at this point, I would personally say that the KD and Kyrie experiment was a failure, but at the same time, I would have that contingency if the Nets were to win an NBA championship either next season or the season following, or basically if they ever were able to win an NBA championship together in Brooklyn, I would quickly change my mind and say it wasn't a failure. But at this point, it's just pretty difficult to say that it's not a failure due to the fact that not only were they not able to win a championship, but they weren't even able to make it to the NBA Finals. But of course, that opinion could change if they were able to win a championship. Now, going forward long term, I will say I am excited to see what the Nets are able to do next season, and if they are motivated after getting swept by the Celtics this year, maybe they can retool, get some new players going into next season, maybe balance out their team a little bit better than it was this season, and maybe their top players in KD and Kyrie could play a little bit better once it comes down to the playoffs, and maybe Ben Simmons could actually play for them, and maybe they could see what they can do from there. Because I don't necessarily think it's impossible for these guys to win a championship going forward, because I think these guys are obviously extremely talented, and the expectations, even after getting swept this season, should be to win an NBA championship even next year. But we'll see what happens going forward for the Nets. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the KD and Kyrie experiment was a failure, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.
Oh yeah, I work with the medics. I'm about to get you injected. I got a couple connections so I can get you prosthetics. Hope you can't go where I'm headed.